Something came back with Artemis II. That is the claim that began spreading after a NASA engineer allegedly sent a private message that moved from one inbox to another, then across forums, and eventually across half the internet. What made the claim so disturbing was not only what it said, but also what NASA did not say afterward. The agency did issue statements. It talked about telemetry. It talked about anomalies. It used careful language, the kind of language agencies use when they want to acknowledge that something happened without opening the door too wide. But what it did not do was deny the story in the blunt, immediate way many people expected. According to those who have seen pieces of the data, something followed Orion home from the moon. Depending on who you ask, it was debris, a navigational artifact, a sensor error, a foreign object, or something that the people closest to the information are still unwilling to name publicly. This is what appears to be known. This is what remains unknown. And this is why the silence around the Artemis II return has become more unsettling than anyone expected. To understand why this matters, we have to begin with the mission itself. Artemis II launched in the early hours of an April morning in 2026, carrying 4 astronauts on a roughly 10-day journey around the moon and back to Earth. It was the first crewed flight of the Orion spacecraft beyond low Earth orbit and the first time humans had traveled beyond the Van Allen belts in more than half a century. The mission was deliberately conservative. There was no lunar landing. There was no attempt to enter lunar orbit. The plan was to send Orion on a free return trajectory, loop around the far side of the moon, and bring the crew safely back to splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. Publicly, the mission worked exactly as intended. The crew returned alive. The capsule landed within a few miles of its target zone. By the standards shown to the public, Artemis II was a clean rehearsal for Artemis III, the mission that would eventually attempt to return humans to the lunar surface. That was the official version. The other version began emerging in fragments about 3 weeks after splashdown, when an engineer working with the navigation team at Johnson Space Center reportedly sent a message to a colleague at Goddard. That message was forwarded, then forwarded again. Eventually, someone took a screenshot and posted it online. By then, too many people had seen it for NASA to pretend the message did not exist. The message did not describe a UFO in dramatic language. It did not make wild claims. It described an object, or perhaps a signature, or a return. The engineer himself seemed unsure what to call it, and that uncertainty is part of what made the message feel real. In paraphrased form, to protect the source, the message said that roughly 6 hours before the trans-Earth injection burn that began Orion's journey home, the spacecraft's tracking systems registered a second object in the same general region of space. It was not docked to Orion. It had not collided with Orion. It was not close enough to trigger a collision alarm or require emergency action. But it was close enough and persistent enough that the return could not simply be dismissed as random noise. The object then appeared to remain with Orion for the entire return trip. 3 days across roughly 240,000 miles, through a region of space that is, statistically speaking, almost completely empty. That emptiness is what makes the claim so strange. The space between the moon and Earth is not crowded like low Earth orbit. It is a vast corridor of vacuum, broken only occasionally by a small rock, a spent upper stage, an old mission fragment, or a piece of hardware that escaped from some long-dead spacecraft. The probability that 2 unrelated objects would naturally travel the same trajectory at the same speed for 3 consecutive days is not technically 0, but it is the kind of probability written with a long string of zeros before the 1. Coincidence remains possible, because coincidence is always possible. But coincidence is not usually where scientists begin. It is where they end up after every cleaner explanation has failed. And as far as the available information suggests, NASA had not yet ruled out every other explanation. The scale is difficult to imagine if you have never thought carefully about how the moon and Earth move relative to each other. The average distance to the moon is about 239,000 miles, nearly 10 times the circumference of Earth. If a person could drive that distance at 60 miles per hour, it would take around 166 days to reach the moon one way. Orion traveled that distance in about 3 days, reaching speeds that peaked around 24,000 miles per hour during the fastest portions of the mission. Whatever was allegedly tracking, Orion had to match those speeds. It had to remain on the same broad trajectory. It had to stay with the spacecraft while Orion made small, automatic course corrections. It had to avoid coming so close that it posed a danger, but also avoid drifting so far away that tracking systems lost it. That final point is the one that continues to bother the people discussing the anomaly. The object did not steadily close the distance. It did not steadily fall behind. It appeared to hold its relative position, as if, for reasons unknown, it was not going to be left behind. There are currently 4 broad explanations being discussed, and none of them fit perfectly. The first explanation is the simplest. The object was a piece of Orion itself, or more specifically, a fragment from the European service module. The service module is the cylindrical section behind the crew capsule that provides power, propulsion, and life support for most of the mission. Spacecraft do shed small amounts of debris during normal operations. Insulation can peel away, small bolts or fragments can loosen, frozen propellant particles can vent from valves and drift into space. If a piece of the service module separated at exactly the right moment, it could theoretically travel along with Orion on a nearly identical path. Both objects would share almost the same trajectory, separated only by the small force that released the debris. They might remain paired for a time before the outer edges of Earth's atmosphere and orbital dynamics separated them. The problem with this explanation is size. The radar return was reportedly consistent with something several feet across, not a flake of insulation or a loose bolt. It was closer to the size of a refrigerator, and something that large is not supposed to detach from the service module without the crew or spacecraft systems noticing. There should have been vibration, attitude changes, or thruster compensation. None of those were publicly reported. The second explanation is space debris. There is debris in cislunar space. Old probes from the Apollo era spent upper stages from Chinese, Indian, and Russian lunar missions, hardware from missions such as Lunar Prospector and LCROSS, and fragments from impactors intentionally crashed into the moon. Some of that material could, in theory, have been in the right place at the right time. A piece of old hardware might have drifted into Orion's path during the lunar swing bee and appeared near the spacecraft during the return phase. But for that debris to then remain with Orion for 3 days requires extremely punishing numbers. It is not impossible, but it is highly unlikely. The space surveillance networks that track known objects in cislunar space reportedly have no catalog entry that matches the object's trajectory. That does not prove the object was not debris, but it does mean the simple version of the debris explanation does not close the case. The third explanation is the one hinted at in the original engineer's message, without being stated outright. It was something that was not ours. This is where the conversation becomes difficult, because the subject carries decades of baggage unrelated to engineering. There is a long record of military pilots, astronauts, and radar operators reporting objects that do not behave like conventional aircraft, satellites, or known natural phenomena. Most of those incidents eventually receive mundane explanations. Some do not. The Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office has acknowledged that a small percentage of cases remain unresolved. If something in cislunar space really matched Orion's trajectory and held position deliberately, the implications would be enormous. But there is also a quieter, less exotic version of this same explanation. Other nations are active in cislunar space. China has an increasingly capable lunar program. India has successfully operated near the lunar South Pole. Russia, despite major difficulties, still has space assets and historical lunar infrastructure. It is possible that a foreign spacecraft or probe was conducting a distant shadow operation, observing Artemis II for intelligence purposes. If confirmed, that would be a serious diplomatic incident. And that is exactly the kind of matter NASA would not announce casually before it had been handled through quiet channels. The fourth explanation is that nothing physical was there at all. The radar returns may have been instrumental error. They may have been reflections of Orion's own signals. They may have come from quirks in the local environment, or from processing artifacts in upgraded tracking software flown on the mission for the first time. In other words, the object could have been a ghost in the machine. This appears to be the direction NASA's public language leaned toward. The phrase used in a briefing was reportedly along the lines of anomalous data consistent with possible sensor calibration issues. That is the kind of wording an agency uses when it wants to close a story, not expand it. But the difficulty is that the original engineer was supposedly not relying on a single sensor. The object was allegedly detected by Orion's own proximity radar, by ground-based tracking from the Deep Space Network, and by an independent optical confirmation from a telescope in Hawaii that had been assigned to image the spacecraft during its return. 3 different instruments, working on 3 different physical principles, reportedly showed the same thing in the same place at the same time. Calibration errors can happen. Processing artifacts can happen. but they do not usually repeat themselves across multiple independent systems in the same way. That raises the next question. What did the astronauts see? Officially, the answer, according to the story, Mission Control made the decision to withhold the information because the contact was non-actionable. That is standard procedure. If the crew cannot do anything about a contact, and if it is not on a collision course, there is no operational reason to burden them with it. Astronauts already have enough to manage. Since splashdown, the 4 Artemis II astronauts have appeared in interviews, press conferences, documentary material, school events, and public conversations with officials. None of them has publicly mentioned seeing anything unusual. Either they were never told, or they were told later and instructed not to discuss it. But one detail has surfaced privately and continues to circulate. During the return trip, the mission commander reportedly asked Houston twice for confirmation of trajectory tracking. Twice in 12 hours is not a constant or frantic request, but it is unusual enough that someone noted it in the flight log. The transcripts of those exchanges have not been released. The flight log entries apparently have, and they state in dry NASA language that the commander requested trajectory verification and was given nominal data. What the commander may have seen, if anything, has not been described publicly. Imagine being one of the 4 astronauts inside Orion. You are seeing what almost no living person has seen. The moon at close range, Earth shrinking into a blue marble, and the blackness between worlds deeper than any night sky on Earth. You are 3 days from home, traveling through emptiness at more than 20,000 miles per hour, looking out at the stars, and perhaps noticing a point of light that should not be there. It is not a star, because it seems to move with you. It is not a planet, because it is too close. It is a small, steady reflection that appears to hold distance day after day, while ground control assures you that everything is nominal. Whatever it was, it would not be easy to sleep. There is precedent for strange observations during lunar missions, and that is part of what makes engineers uneasy. The Apollo missions had their own list of unexplained sightings. On Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin reported seeing an object outside the spacecraft while traveling to the moon. The crew could not identify it. Houston suggested it might be the discarded upper stage of the Saturn V. Aldrin checked where that stage should have been and found that it did not match the location of the object. Decades later, Aldrin said in interviews that he still did not know what it had been and had stopped trying to solve it. Apollo 12 reported a similar kind of object. Apollo 17 did as well. These reports were not wild or theatrical. They were quiet, professional, and consistent. They came from trained observers, some of the most carefully selected people in aviation history, looking out of spacecraft windows and seeing things they could not immediately explain. The reports were filed, archived, and largely forgotten by the public until they reappeared through declassified documents and renewed interest in the 1990s and 2000s. None of this proves anything about Artemis II. Most Apollo sightings have plausible ordinary explanations: debris, ice crystals, reflections, or spacecraft hardware. But the pattern is suggestive enough that when a new report comes from a modern lunar mission, the people inside NASA who remember the old files may not dismiss it as quickly as the public expects. The physics of the Artemis II claim is also worth examining, because the numbers create their own problem. For an object to maintain position with Orion across roughly 240,000 miles of return trajectory, it would need to share the same trans-Earth injection conditions. If a piece of debris broke off at exactly the right moment during or near the burn, it might ride along with the same momentum. But Orion reportedly made 3 small course correction burns during the return phase. These burns were tiny, only a few feet per second of velocity change, designed to fine-tune the spacecraft's entry corridor for splashdown. A passive object cannot match course corrections. After each burn, it should slowly drift away. By the 3rd correction, any debris that began close to Orion should have been hundreds of miles off from the spacecraft's path. The tracked object, according to the claims, did not drift away. It made the corrections or did something equivalent to them. That is the detail engineers keep circling back to. Passive debris does not adjust trajectory. Reflections do not adjust trajectory. Sensor artifacts do not adjust trajectory. Whatever was being tracked behaved as if it had a reason to stay where it was. That is the core of the mystery. The investigation is reportedly being handled by a small team within NASA's Engineering and Safety Center, the group responsible for reviewing anomalies that do not fit ordinary categories. Over the years, the center has handled many cases, from famous incidents to forgotten technical problems. Most are resolved within months as mundane issues. Some never resolve and are quietly archived under labels such as unable to determine. The Artemis II tracking anomaly is said to remain in an active investigation queue. NASA has allegedly confirmed that much, but it has not committed to a public timeline for a final report. Meanwhile, fragments of data have leaked through engineers, contractors, and former employees who do not all agree on what the evidence means, but who appear to agree that something was present in the data. Radar returns have reportedly appeared in academic papers as anonymized datasets. Imagery from the Hawaii telescope has allegedly been analyzed by researchers at MIT and Cornell. Deep Space Network records have reportedly been requested under the Freedom of Information Act by multiple news organizations. The information is coming out in pieces, not all at once, and not always in order. But those pieces, taken together, suggest this. An object of unknown origin maintained position with Orion for approximately 72 hours during its return from the Moon. It was detected by 3 independent instruments, using different physical principles. Its mass, composition, and original trajectory remain unknown. NASA has not publicly identified it, and the leading internal hypotheses are said to be sensor error, debris of unknown origin, foreign reconnaissance, and unspecified. The word unspecified is the one that has captured the attention of space journalists and observers. NASA does not usually keep explanations on a list after they have been excluded. If unspecified remains in a working document, that means the engineers have not been able to eliminate the possibility that the object was something they cannot identify with the tools and assumptions currently available to them. That is not confirmation of anything alien or exotic, but it is a quiet admission that the normal box of explanations may not yet contain the answer. The Artemis program continues. Artemis III, the first crewed lunar landing attempt of the modern era, remains scheduled on the program timeline. Hardware is being assembled. Astronauts have been selected. The mission profile has not been publicly altered. That matters, because if NASA truly believes something hostile or hazardous was operating in cislunar space, the responsible response would likely be delay. The fact that the program is continuing suggests one of several things. Engineers do not think the anomaly is a threat to crew safety. They do not think it will repeat. They believe it can be mitigated before the next launch. Or they believe the entire story is noise built around misunderstood data. That last possibility may be correct. Most leaks about NASA programs over the decades have turned out to be partial truths, misreadings, or outright fabrications. Space attracts mystery, and mystery attracts attention. The gap between what people want to believe and what is actually true is often filled with stories. But the original engineer's message had a specific, plain quality that makes it difficult to dismiss completely. It did not speculate. It did not editorialize. It described a tracked object, 3 sensor confirmations, and a trajectory match lasting 3 days. There was no flourish, no grand conspiracy, only an engineer who saw something in the data and believed colleagues should know. He was reportedly suspended pending review. He was not fired, which some interpret as a sign that he had legitimate access to the material he leaked. NASA does not normally protect the careers of people who fabricate serious technical claims. So where does that leave the story? It leaves it in an uncomfortable middle. Something appears to have happened, but no one outside the investigation can say exactly what. The agency responsible for answering the question is still working on it. The engineer who sparked the discussion is not speaking publicly. The astronauts who flew the mission are not discussing anything unusual. The limited data that has surfaced can support several explanations, but none fits perfectly. In the meantime, the object remains unidentified in the catalog, reportedly marked with a designation that translates roughly to presence confirmed, identity unknown. The Apollo astronauts returned with moon rocks. Artemis II returned with a question. Eventually, there will be an answer. NASA does not leave active investigations open forever. A report will reach someone's desk. Engineers will sign off. A public version will likely be released with caveats, careful wording, and perhaps redactions. It may say debris. It may say calibration error. It may say foreign asset. It may say something else entirely. When that happens, we will know more about what occurred in the void between the Moon and Earth during that 1 week in April. Until then, the only honest statement is that something was reportedly out there, something that was not expected to be there, and the people closest to the answer are not yet ready to explain it. Space has a long history of keeping its secrets longer than we want. The darkness between worlds is patient. It has been waiting longer than any of us have been alive, and it can wait a little longer. The engineer's message reportedly ended with one line that stayed with everyone who read it. It was not a warning. It was not a theory. It was simply an observation, typed into a chat window late on a Tuesday night, weeks after splashdown. It went home with us. 3 words. No punctuation, no explanation. The kind of sentence someone writes only after thinking about something for too long and finally needing to put it somewhere outside their own mind. Whatever it was, it is now part of the quiet space between Earth and the Moon. Or perhaps closer than that. The investigation will continue. The next mission will fly. And somewhere in the data, one unresolved signal will remain, waiting for someone to determine what it truly was. The universe rarely gives answers on our schedule. It answers when it is ready, and not a moment before.